Hello everyone. My name is Tessa Green. I'm the Program Director for the Good Systems Grand Challenge. I want to thank you for joining us for the Industry Response to Government Procurement Policy panel. Today's panel is part of a week of programming exploring how procurement guidelines can influence the development of AI for good. And it represents a first of its kind collaboration between a university and the World Economic Forum. As one of 3 UT Austin Grand Challenges, Good Systems brings together researchers from across the UT campus to investigate how we can ensure AI technologies benefit society. This partnership with the World Economic Forum showcases our combined commitment to improving the state of the world through AI and technology. Today's program focuses on what implications government procurement guidelines will have for industry. And here to provide the official UT welcome is Interim Dean for UT's McCombs School of Business, Lillian F. Mills. Dr. Mills's research in tax compliance, international taxation, and accounting for income taxes and effective tax rates arose through her impressive list of professional experience with places like Price Waterhouse, the U.S. Department of Treasury, the IRS, the Accounting Review, and Contemporary Accounting Research, just to name a few. We are so honored to have her join us today. Please welcome Dean Mills.
Thank you, Tessa. It's an honor to be here to welcome the World Economic Forum to the University of Texas at Austin. Our McCombs School of Business is a natural host for today's panel on the industry response to government procurement policy, because we're a leader in analytics and policy. Our motto is human-centered, future-focused, and our graduates are known globally for bringing teamwork and collegiality to their application of cutting-edge knowledge. What starts here changes the world. We have a top-ranked master's in business analytics that teaches subjects on AI, machine learning, predictive analytics. And the McCombs School houses 2 important research centers. Our Center for Analytics and Transformative Technologies hosted its annual summit this November on the ethics and bias in AI systems, where we had more than 1,000 attendees from around the globe. We also host our Salem Center for Policy, which helps researchers and students debate substantive policy issues through the lens of rigorous data analysis. And both of these centers work with our cross-campus partners like the Good Systems Initiative. And so we're really pleased to be here. Today, our panel addresses how industry responds to procurement policies, and governments have a unique power to influence our behavior and norms to the types of technologies the government incentivizes for research, development, support. And these policies are going to govern massive spending. So to date, it's been a little ad hoc and uneven, and the World Economic Forum plays a key role in trying to provide guidance on best practices, responsible policies, and realistic expectations. Thankfully, the public sector knows it's not an expert on these issues and welcomes voices from business leaders, industry professionals, and academic experts. And so we're so happy that you're joining us in the audience and that this distinguished panel is going to bring the best thought leadership to us today. So Tessa, let me turn it back over to you, and thank you for including me this morning.
Thank you, Dean Mills. Before we begin our panel, I have a couple housekeeping details. This panel is being recorded and we will share it with registrants, and it'll be available on our website following the event. During the panels, we invite you to submit questions through the Q&A tab on the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen, and you can also upvote questions that you like. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the chair for today's panel discussion, the Good Systems Research Director for Fair and Transparent AI, Joydeep Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh is the Schlumberger Centennial Chair Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Texas. He also serves as the Chief Scientist of Cognitive Scale, which was selected in 2018 to be among the 61 technology pioneers worldwide by the World Economic Forum. Joydeep also sits on the board of directors at AI Global, a nonprofit dedicated to building responsible AI systems. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joydeep Ghosh.
Thank you, Tessa, and a warm welcome and good morning to you all from UT, the World Economic Forum, Dean Mills, and myself. Yesterday, we had a stellar panel that covered fundamental issues regarding AI procurement, primarily from a policy perspective. And today, we'll continue that discussion by bringing in an industrial perspective. I'm particularly excited about today's panel because it has experts that work at the intersection of ethics, technology, policy, and who have a deep personal industrial perspective. So on day one, Kay from the World Economic Forum mentioned that AI is expected to bring, add another 13 trillion, that's T as in T-Rex, $trillion to the global economy by 2030. To bring that forecasted number to fruition for industries to innovate and thrive and bring broad benefits to society while mitigating the risks of AI, whether they be in terms of new inequities in society or unintended consequences and harms of AI, it's very important that the right incentives are placed there. And so that the industry can move and fulfill this promise. In yesterday's panel, somebody mentioned that innovation goes at the speed of trust, and building trustworthy systems is the key to fulfilling this societal promise. So in my own research, I work in machine learning, so I look at building trustworthy AI systems much more from a statistical machine learning viewpoint. But as part of the board of directors of AI Global, which is a nonprofit headquartered in Austin, and in cooperation with the World Economic Forum, University of Texas, and several other entities, including Cognitive Scale, which I'm also affiliated with, we are trying to develop the world's first responsible AI certification mark. And it's very clear that in that process, it's definitely needed and critical, but it's just not easy. And you have to bring in multiple viewpoints to bear to figure out the right move forward. So today, I think we'll get insights into some of these viewpoints that'll come out. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the panelists today to talk about the government policies that will affect AI in industry. 3 panelists are joining today. So what I'll do is I'll introduce them one by one. They'll make some brief comments. We'll have one round of questions, mostly directly from the panel. But most importantly, and the part I always look forward the most, are the questions from the audience. So participants, I encourage you all to suggest thought-provoking questions and also upvote other people's questions through the Q&A tab on the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. So select questions will be fielded towards the end of the panel for the general discussion. So with that, let's go. So I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Steve Elmore. Steve is the head of client services at KUNGFU.AI. I love the name. He's a senior exec with more than 25 years of experience leading client and professional services, customer success, and product development. Steve is the founder and CEO of Salsa AI, another great name, and SVP of Global Services at Cerebri AI, and a trusted advisor to many of the world's largest enterprises, NGOs, and government agencies. He's a decorated veteran of the US Air Force, having served in the Cold War and Desert Storm. He holds a doctorate of business administration focused on organizational and leadership ethics, and has developed and taught courses in ethics, marketing, and business communication. Steve.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh. I appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here. I'm so happy to be a part of this panel. I spent a great deal of my career navigating really highly complex procurement processes in government and industry. from the vendor side. So it's really great to have this opportunity to speak to my experience and hopefully contribute and add to your knowledge. I think it's really important for anyone who's purchasing goods and services in AI to have a really strong, in anything, to have a strong partnership with their vendors. And so it'll result in fewer surprises after the signature. And this is really particularly important in AI, because not only is it highly experimental, the work, but also there's usually an ethical component to it that we need to consider. So a large part of my career has been about, and even to this day, has been about education. I love to teach, I love to learn, love to be a part of learning organizations. One of the things I love about AI is the rate of innovation, the rate at which we take new knowledge and be able to put that into models and put that out into production very quickly. So it's really critical for anyone that's working in AI services to educate their clients, to keep them up to speed, to help have them understand what it is that we're doing and that we don't end up in these black box scenarios. The industry is moving faster than the legislators. And so I think we have an increased responsibility to establish kind of our own guardrails, as we're going to all have to live with the consequences of the work that we're doing. So I'm very honored to be part of KUNGFU.AI. I joined in 2020, lead our client services group, and we work with our clients to help ensure that they're successful in not only creating really new and innovative models in machine learning, but putting those into production and solving real world problems. It's a great company, and one of the, I prior to even joining the company, I knew the founders for a while and knew their orientation. And one of their huge areas of focus was ethics, which was near and dear to my heart because that was my doctoral area of focus. And so we have a super strong ethics program within the organization. I'll be talking about it a little bit more later today, but again, super happy to be here. Thank you for having me, and looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Steve. So let me introduce the second panelist. That's Will Griffin. Will is the Chief Ethics Officer of Hypergiant Industries, where he has developed and implemented a uniquely effective company-wide AI ethics framework. Will is the recipient of the IEEE Award for Distinguished Ethical Practices. His top of minds ethics framework won the Communitas Award for Ethics. His past entrepreneurial work has earned him the prestigious IAB Brand Week Silver Medal for Innovation and the culturally significant NAACP Image Award. His career has taken him from investment banking to consulting to media to tech. He has a JD from Harvard Law School and a Bachelor of Arts from Dartmouth. Will.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be a participant on this panel. I'm the Chief Ethics Officer at Hypergiant Industries. Hypergiant is an artificial intelligence company based here in Austin. We focus on kind of three main verticals: defense, critical infrastructure, and space. My role in the company is to help our engineers, R&D team, and developers and designers create a way to vet each use case before it is presented back to the client. So the kind of way it works for us is the first step is a client has a business or a tech solution that they come to us to solve. Our R&D designers and developers and engineers come up with a menu of potential business and tech solutions to that problem. We then come in along with our designers, developers, and engineers, and we vet those potential business and tech solutions using our ethical reasoning model. The solutions that then pass muster are then presented back to the client. So in that way, we don't rely on the client's ethics. We don't rely on their values. We don't rely on their system. They only get an opportunity to choose between a menu of previously ethically vetted tech solutions. What we have found, contrary to a lot of popular belief that unlike compliance, ethical reasoning should actually make your engineers and your designers more creative. So we have found that our ethical reasoning process increases the number of business and technical solutions rather than decreases them. I think the root of the reason why that's true is because our model requires you to expand your universe of potential stakeholders to include all of society. So when you have more stakeholders, then you come up with more solutions. And I think that's been successful for us. I've been fortunate to work at a company with the CEO, Ben Lamb, who kind of had a grand vision, which is for Hypergiant to deliver on the future that we were promised. So that's flying cars, precision medicine, carbon neutral technology. And so I was attracted to that vision. And fortunately, I've been given a lot of leeway in support to try to integrate our model into what it is that we do in the products and services we do for our client. The reason why I think today's panel, or even this week's panel, is super important is because regulators, as Steve has said, because regulators and policymakers are so far behind industry, regulations will not come fast enough. And it will not be in place to protect society in the way that you would traditionally look at it in an industry, because the innovation is way ahead of the policymakers. So it's going to be imperative for there to be self-governance, which is kind of what Steve was talking about, and I'm sure the other panels were talking about, but I don't think we can rely on that. So the one power that the government has until they regulate is their market power. And their market power comes in the form of procurement, and procurement is substantial. So I'll give you just an example. And I always, and I'm excited about this week because this is an example I always bring up to regulators and legislators and governments at the state and local level when we talk to them, which is to say, you already have the power. So before you have all the information you need to regulate the technology, you already have the power to regulate the market and to implement your values. So in 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. That executive order required the integration of the military. It also required defense contractors to have equal employment opportunity practices. So to put this in context, in 1948, that's almost 20 years before the Civil Rights Act, before the Voting Rights Act, before what people have come to popularly know as affirmative action, and before 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, which was the integration of public schools. So when Truman did this, this caused the defense industry to become the first industry to actually have non-discrimination in their rules and in their codes. And I think it was this is probably one of the most significant executive orders ever passed in the history of the United States, and certainly probably the strongest one in terms of procurement being used to implement American values. And I think that anytime I talk to a purchasing organization at the city, federal, state level, I always bring this example up because your procurement power actually is how you will be able to get your values into the marketplace, which quite frankly is going to be the only place in the short term where you can have a big impact. So I'm excited about this discussion today to learn from the other panels and learn from the attendees. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Will. So last but not least, I have the third panelist, Dr. Xiaoshan Liu. Dr. Liu is the CEO of Perceptin, an intelligence transportation company. His technical research focuses on autonomous driving technologies and robotics. He has published over 60 research papers, over 40 US patents, and over 150 international patents on autonomous driving technologies and robotics. Dr. Liu is the distinguished speaker of the IEEE Computer Society, a distinguished speaker of ACM, a founder of the IEEE Special Technical Community on Autonomous Driving Technologies. So folks, if you're interested in self-driving cars, he's the person to ask questions. Dr. Liu received a Master's of Public Administration from Harvard Kennedy School and a PhD in computer engineering from UC Irvine. So Xiaoshan Liu, please.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Ghosh. So Let me give a very brief introduction to the background of Perception. It was established in 2016 to develop autonomous vehicles. So we focus on the micro-mobility market, which is the 1 to 5 mile transportation market. As you can imagine, we target local buses, local transportation services. Therefore, government AI procurement is a big part of our business. But in the past few years, we have faced with a lot of difficulties when performing AI procurement projects for governments. Especially, we have two main markets. One is Japan. The other one is the United States. It's quite interesting. Let me do a compare and contrast first. In Japan, it's more like, Japan and other Asian countries, it's more a top-down approach. You have to deal with the national level government first to get a permit, and then go to the local level to persuade them to go through the whole compliance process. In the United States, it's bottom-up process. You start with the local government and so on. So I have a few summaries to make. The first summary is that, or conclusion is that in the past 20 years, we have enjoyed the benefits of globalization, but today's AI procurement process is anti-globalization, meaning that you have to deploy a very ad hoc process against a very standardized process for AI procurement. Second of all, in the past 20, 30 years, we have built a global supply chain, but the companies today who are working in AI are mostly startups. They don't have enough resources to deal with all these compliance standards issues. We are not Microsoft, we are not Google. So, but as a startup, we still have to handle all these different requirements. But if there were a standard, a global standard for AI procurement, that would make our life much easier. I agree with all other panelists, what they said. Today, legislation is so far behind the industry. And I'm not sure whether it's too much policy or the lack of procurement policy that's constraining the development of this field. But today, I hope to share our experience of doing AI procurement projects in Asia and in the United States. And hopefully our lessons can contribute to the standardization of the whole process. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Xiaoshan. So before we get started with the Q&A, we'll be having 3 polls and during this panel. And the first poll is a question for the audience. And the question is as follows: with whom does responsibility for the ethical development of contracted AI ML solution ultimately lie? So is it the purchaser, a supplier, or both? So please click the radio button before the screen goes away. So let's go with the first round of questions. So I'm going to ask the same question to everyone because you know, sometimes this whole notion of policy and its implication on your plan of action, your research, your technology, your products is a little bit abstract. So hopefully they'll give you some concrete examples of what's involved. So the question is as follows. I'm going to ask the panelists to describe a specific procurement process that they were involved in or have a first-hand knowledge of that illustrates the challenges or benefits of sound procurement policies and lessons learned from the industrial perspective. So let's maybe change the order, or we have a volunteer. Maybe Will, could you go first?
So the first-hand process, there is no standard way that AI is being procured at the moment from governmental entities. So higher ed has a way of doing it. Local, city, federal, state entities have a way of doing it. And all of those ways are different. There is not a standard even within higher ed how to procure. The only thing that's consistent is there's either some form of business office or some purchasing or some procurement office that just has some standard ways of that they order technologies. But because they don't understand the way AI works, and because there are, even within the AI universe, so many different types of products and services and solutions, you don't always talk to the same person at each entity. And the way they purchase isn't always the same way. So sometimes you're licensing a software, sometimes you're licensing a platform, sometimes you're paying for consulting or a solution, sometimes you're just paying for design, sometimes you're paying for development. So there is no standard way that AI is being purchased and procured at the present time. That's a problem. And I think that's why it's even more important on the purchasing side or the procurement side to have a set of values. And these values are not purchasing values. They're not procurement values. They're company values. They're a company mission statement. And then you give the latitude to what would be our clients in order to come up with business and tech solutions that conform to what those values are for those companies. That would be helpful, because I think even as we go forward, there's not going to be one standard way that people acquire quote unquote AI solutions. So I'll give you kind of a real world example. The people who order robot process automation, they will not be the same group that orders sentiment analysis. So there's a marketing group on one place that's going to get sentiment analysis, and there is an engineering group somewhere else, or a construction group, if this is the type of company it is, that will be ordering robot process automation. So the purchasing in that respect cannot be standardized, but the values that the company stands for, those can be consistent across. And so today it's really a grab bag. Like, I don't know everybody else's experience, but for us, it has been a grab bag. So we have experience with, kind of to what, to the previous panelist said, we have one of our bigger clients is a Japanese multinational conglomerate, a 500-year-old company. They move at a totally different pace than some of the work that we do even for the Department of Defense. And people think the Department of Defense is slow, but it still moves at a different pace. And so the way the procurement happens, even at the international level, is completely different. So that's the reason why we always try to get our clients to hone in on their values first. Make sure everyone in the company understands that. Once they have their values together, then we can work out the logistics of procurement, implementation, follow-up, client service, and support.
Terrific. So Will, basically you said that there is no one size fits all. In fact, it looks like all sizes are different. But what could be done is to have a consistent corporate ethical value. So then the question would be, A, would that be fairly universal, or that would also depend from company to company? And B, if one size cannot fit all, which I think is very reasonable, then can there be a few sizes that will fit most? Is that achievable or not? From both the procurement
So
policy.
if the follow-up question is about values,
yeah,
then, so now we get to, and especially in the world we operate in, we get into the big geopolitical values discussion. So, in the 80s, people were talking about Western versus Eastern values. Now that's kind of changed, because what the previous panelist said about globalization, we have a common set of values that, are starting to emerge on an international consensus. But when we have technology that can shape the entire future of humanity, it resurfaces those old culture clashes. So that's the reason why right now we're in a really a geopolitical, our AI battle is also a geopolitical battle against China. And so what's happening today, Russia is a bit player in there. I mean, they're trying to be a player in there, but they're not really a factor, but they're in the conversation. But ultimately, there's a big geopolitical battle going on. So when you say consensus on values, I think there are going to be country-specific values, what we would traditionally call Western values, and then there's going to be China in their satellite countries in the set of values that they have. And that's basically going to be framed of democracy versus more of a controlled society. That's ultimately the debate. And so with AI, what we're most afraid of is the technology that thinks for us, that acts for us, that replaces us, and has power over us, which ultimately hurts our democracy and limits our freedom. Whereas on the other side, China has been able to deploy their AI in a way that's consistent with their values of a centralized command economy controlled country. And so it's really easy for them to implement AI without all of these debates. And so what you're going to see is in the geopolitics is going to kind of mess this up and interfere in this, but what you're going to see is something like a Cold War of competing values, which is democracy and freedom and centralized controlled society. And so what we always push forward is obviously, and part of it is because of where we are, but also part of it is what we really believe, which is that people inherently want to be free. People inherently want autonomy. We believe that we've been able to make the progress that we've been able to have as a country and as a civilization because of freedom, and we're always on that side. And so it's super important for us to correct companies and governments and other actors in our part of the world when they take market power in a way that moves them closer to a command economy or a command system. And so I think that's the reason why you see there being so much scrutiny on Facebook, Twitter, Google, because what they have effectively created for themselves is their own power center with control over constituencies in human beings. And so we're always, and people who know stuff about our framework know it's rooted in Immanuel Kant's deontological perspective. We come from a Western value perspective, but we also believe that our Western values don't put us in conflict with the rest of the world. But what they should do is they should highlight our obligations and duties in service that we owe to the rest of the world, even if they don't share our beliefs.
Okay, that is terrific. So, so let me ask the same question with Dr. Liu, which is, can you give some specific examples of procurement you were involved in, and what were the lessons learned from them?
Definitely. We hope that there's one size that fits all. That's our ask. When we did the project in Japan, the Japanese government asked us to start from the top level. So we have to go to the Department of Transportation to get a certificate to allow us to run autonomous driving services within Japan. With that certificate, then we can go down to the next level of government, and then finally the city government. And then each level of government, they care about different kind of things. Sometimes it's privacy, sometimes it's security. It almost seems that they are confused. They don't know what to ask, but they have to ask about something to make sure that they are comfortable with our deployment. So when they ask about privacy, then we would ask back, what kind of standard you use? They don't have anything in mind. So we have to provide proof that this does not violate their privacy concern and so on. So there's no standard to follow. So here I'm a bit confused, whether it's the lack of policy or too much policy that's constraining the deployment of AI within Japan. So the other thing is in United States, we tried in Indiana, Columbus, the city of Columbus, Indiana. That's completely the other way around. We have to start with the local government to get a special permit to run the service within the city. Then we go to the state and the federal government, Department of Transportation, and so on. So that makes me think, and sometimes they ask about when they do procurement projects, especially government-backed procurement projects, they have to scrutinize every single component within the product. But today we are living in a world of globalization. Sometimes some parts come from, say, South Korea, the other parts come from China. Then they have to ask us to provide certificates for each and every component within the product. And as you can imagine, for autonomous vehicle, there are 20, 30, or even more components within that one single product. For a startup like us, it's very hard to do all kinds of certification in order to pass all the scrutinization in order to win the contract. So for us, it would be very nice if we had a global standard to guide each and every single government when they do procurement projects. In the past 2 or 3 decades, we have benefited from globalization. And there's one organization, the World Trade Organization, providing all the regulations for different kind of projects or trade projects. But today, would it be the World Economic Forum that's providing that kind of guidance, or would it be for engineering side? Would that be IEEE? We don't know, right? So hopefully through this forum, through this panel, we can at least kick off some efforts towards that, towards a global standardization for AI procurement. So otherwise, this field, artificial intelligence, is mainly fueled by startups like Perception and like other small companies. The startups are constrained by the available resources and fundings. We're not Google, we're not Facebook. If we had to spend, say, 40, 50% of our budget dealing with all these regulation certificates, there's no way we can move this field forward. So that's my ask. Can we do a global standard on AI procurement? That's through our own painful experiences.
Yeah, so actually, as I mentioned, through AI Global, we are trying to come up with a certification mark, and that has to be fairly well accepted and global. So we have entities outside the US, including World Economic Forum, the Reisman Institute from Toronto, and so on. I think that could be very helpful. But you bring up a very important point, because even when a company is trying to develop their models and think about the solutions and think about the ethics and the trustworthiness of the solutions, what happens is quite often they're getting data from third-party vendors. They're getting other partial solutions or models, say AI solutions from third-party vendors. And we've actually, through Cognitive Scale, I've had several clients tell me, can you put a meter on what I'm getting from a third party so I can understand the trustworthiness of that thing that I'm incorporating in my solution. And so we did some vetting in the past, but now things are very different. They're statistical models, data-driven, with uncertain behavior. How can you quantify that so that I have some idea about the overall reliability of solutions where in a global world, they can come from anywhere on Earth? Okay, great. So I would finally also ask Steve this question, and while he responds, again, for the participants, please ask questions. Even your comments could be disguised as questions, so that's also kosher. Please do that through the Q&A button in the bottom. So Steve, please.
Yeah, thank you. First, I just want to echo the comments of Will and Xiaoshan. I think they're spot on. I think values alignment is, just as an aside, is really critical. I think as an organization, as a vendor, you need to have a thorough understanding of your own values to give you a framework for decision making when it comes to potential projects that may come up. And I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the values alignment is really critical. And I think that can get missed a lot of times in the desire just to obtain work and not think about the unintended consequences of certain pursuits. So I'll just say, I think that's really critical. One of the, I've done a lot of work with large government agencies, with regulated industry, with super large, auto manufacturers, and it's interesting. Everybody has a different take on procurement. They all approach it differently, and there are some common themes that I see. One is that there's this weird wall between purchasing and the group that's actually buying your service or product. And in some cases, they will actually regulate the conversation and prevent kind of this free flow of information. This becomes particularly problematic with machine learning because there are some things that you really need to know that are very nuanced, and without really great conversations with people that own the data, the people that are actually trying to solve that problem, they try to encapsulate it in a form that procurement uses to buy erasers and pens and other things, that they're systems that were not designed for machine learning purchasing. So if you have a purchasing agent who isn't adept at it, who doesn't have this understanding of how AI and machine learning works, they're just following the same process that they've always followed. And a lot of times that results in this disconnect. And where that's manifested itself for me in one really unfortunate case was a complete data catastrophe, where not only did we had no way to access the data to build a feedback loop, but we found out that the data legacy was a catastrophe. They had no idea who had been creating the data over years, and especially in larger organizations where they have grown through acquisition. All of that institutional knowledge a lot of times is lost through each acquisition. That goes back to how the data was captured, why did they capture it, and so this certainly manifests itself a lot of times in data bias. So so I think that's a big fundamental problem, and so you need to be able to have these really frank conversations with the people that you're actually going to work with during, at the very beginning of the process. And so that is one of the things that we frankly kind of insist on, is if we can't talk to them, we can't make the decision. And I think you have to have your shoes on, be willing to walk away if it's going to be something that's not going to work for you. So one of the things that occurs to me is there are some great models out there already in other industries for how they're able to solve, I think, the general problem that we're talking about. If you think about, like, say, a big public project, like some kind of architectural project, there's usually some period of public review, where they ask for input, like, here's our idea. There are all kinds of things that are already in place, I think, in other types of work, where I think it would lend itself really well to machine learning, so that there is more transparency, in particular, especially if there's going to be government procurement. I mean, aside from secret and classified work, but for things where there's going to be some kind of public impact, I firmly believe there should be some period of public review and input, and certainly a huge amount of scrutiny around the data and any implications that not only the data you're using has, but the data that you're going to create and how that could be used afterwards. Again, that certainly becomes part of the decision-making process, whether or not you want to pursue something. But again, I don't know how many vendors out there are actually willing to be selective about the work. So.
So Steve, I think your comments about the data catastrophe are spot on. And there's actually been an effort from researchers from Microsoft, Google, and others. It's called data sheets for data sets. So if you have a data set, you should hopefully it'll come with a detailed fact sheet, just like you get from, say, an electrical component or food item, there's a nutritional label, but I think it's really in its infancy. So, the examples they have, each data set has 4 or 5 pages of description, where did it come from? Did you pay for it? Blah, blah, blah. And it looks like it's still very, very inadequate, because quite often data is just not one big table, but it just comes and grows over time and gets merged with many other sources and takes a life of its own. And then how do you come up with a specification for that, so that any system that is built, say machine learning system built on such data, has some guarantees. So that's, I think, a very critical area to address. I'm not sure how government procurement policies could influence that, other than procurement could ensure that every data set used has to come up with hopefully agreed to data sheet format, but that's clearly an important consideration. So thank you for that. I will start another round of questioning. But before that, we'll have our second poll. And that is the following very simple question. It says, should there be a supplier certification mechanism to help ensure the ethical development of government-sponsored AI ML solutions? And in fact, I didn't see this question before, but this kind of relates to the comment on data sheets. Would be an example of a supplier certification mechanism. Okay, I hope I didn't influence your answers, but the poll should show up on your screen, so please respond to it. So while we do that, I would now ask different questions to the panelists. So maybe I'll go in the reverse order. So I'll start with Steve this time. So KUNGFU.AI has an ethical scoring system, and we are very curious on how it works and how they've been able to share it and communicate it with government clients.
Yeah, so thanks. So where we actually begin is with our team, and we survey our team on what we call kind of hot button issues. What are the things that we have an affinity towards as an organization, the types of projects and work that we're going to do, and things that we say, hey, we're not going to touch this. So as an organization, for example, we will not touch facial recognition. So we don't touch any of those projects. There are others where there's a range of things that we will consider, and sometimes that's based on industry. Sometimes that's based on the specific type of class of model that might be built, the data that would be used, the unintended consequences of what might be developed. So all of those things are taken into consideration in terms of our own internal alignment, and then using that as a starting point for understanding how we want to approach projects. And we turn down a lot of projects because they don't align with our values, and we see them as being problematic. A lot of times we will have conversations with the client about, hey, let's think about this a different way, and what are the things that we can do to make this safer. And so that's where the education part comes in. So we begin with an opportunity, and we prepare a case. We'll have a project summary. We ID the external stakeholders. We figure out what the key issues are. We'll gather whatever supporting research we need, and then really understand what the state of the data is, and kind of encapsulate all that into a case summary. And then also make sure that we just purely don't have a legal issue, because that's the easiest decision point right there. So from there, it goes into a stakeholder discussion internally. So similar to what Will had described, we look at support internally for KUNGFU, what the customer support is for it, and then what the public perception may be as well. What would be the public support for it? We also look at it on another axis along negative impact, and then same thing around alignment with values and the direction that we want to go as an organization. So those all become feedback points and kind of a scoring that then move us to an issues discussion stage, and then further beyond that, a data discussion. And then we move to essentially a framework for ethical decision making. And so we look at it across, essentially three lanes. So consequentialist, duty, and virtue. So consequentialist, that your aim is to produce the most good. Duty, your aim is to perform the right action. Virtue, your aim is to maintain your character. So we look at that. And so when we're deliberating about it, and we look at it from a consequentialist viewpoint, we're asking, what kind of outcomes are we trying to produce? What should we be doing? And then if we're looking at it from a duty perspective, what are my obligations? And what are the things that I should never do? And if I'm looking at it from a virtue perspective, it's like, well, what kind of people are we, or are we trying to be? And what will these actions show about our character? And so this becomes an important filter for us in getting then to the point where we have a rationale for the solution. We look at any potential alternatives. We make sure that we've got a clear definition of the problem, and that ultimately becomes a go or no go for the project. So we have had, recently, to kind of answer the question about have we shared this, we recently had an opportunity that came up, and there were two primary issues. One was around essentially the potential to skirt regulatory, kind of a regulatory view of the outcome, and then also just problematic data. And that the data set was not going to ultimately be representative of the ultimate people that would be affected by the model that was built, and that became hugely problematic, and especially if it could result in physical harm. So those are in generally how we approach it and look at it. Our company, we meet every week. We have an ethics council that meets weekly, and we go over all kinds of topics. So typically it'll be any kind of an opportunity that's coming up, but then it's also a lot of self-examination. It's really understanding us as an organization so that we can be better in having a coherent view when we start to look at opportunities, and when we engage with our clients, and then also when we recognize that there might be problems. So ultimately, everything that our output of this process goes into a decision log, and then at some point we do a post-mortem. We do look at risk and social impact. We create a data sheet, and we have a model card, and so these are all outputs of the projects to make sure that we can look back and say, do we have some drift organizationally in terms of, we started with one point of view, we get through this project, do we have a new insight as to this type of work, this client, how we feel about things. So that's been, I think, one of the joys for me in working with Kung Fu is this openness about ethics and focus on ethics, and ensuring that the work that we do, that we're aligned about, that we can be passionate about this, and that we can provide assurance to our clients that we're in this because we truly believe in the work.
Wow. Well, that's an amazing amount of introspection. That's really impressive. And I'm just wondering, the companies like Google, Microsoft, Twitter, Facebook, who really impacted the entire community, and, in some sense, maybe, enabled all sorts of fake news and so on, whether they go through this level of introspection before any. So I'm just curious, you have any idea about that? Or maybe Will has some thoughts on that as well.
Well, no, they don't. And one of our board of advisors, Sangeeta Mudnall, was one of the architects of Microsoft's responsible AI entire platform within Microsoft Research. And so pretty much everything we know about FAT and FATE, that was really designed by Microsoft. And I credit Microsoft for really being a pioneer in the responsible AI area. I think that they've done the more work than any other company to try to formalize processes for what we do. So I consider Microsoft to be an outlier in the industry all the way around. They were one of the first ones after the Black Lives Matter protests to have a moratorium, after IBM, to have a moratorium on selling facial recognition to law enforcement. Like, I believe at this point, they take their responsibility to society very seriously, but we have to remember how they got here. They fought all the wars, every single war with every single regulator on every level all over the world. Microsoft has fought them all from the 80s and still fighting them in every jurisdiction. There's not a tech obligation to society, tech right to rights war, selling to different regimes around the world. There's not a single war that Microsoft has not fought on the tech and ethics line. So they figured out a number of things, including writing the facial recognition law in Washington for the legislators, writing the equivalent law in California. They already have the law for AI written that they're now lobbying to try to get passed in Congress. So they figured out a few things. Google, nowhere, right? They just fired their top 2 ethics people, who they hired and trumpeted as the people who are going to usher in ethics into the AI and into the tech space. Well, they both are fired. They're in litigation with both. Their ethics team is completely dispirited, and they haven't shown any inclination whatsoever to want to be responsible outside of what you described, which are, you know, and you do give them credit for, you know, for model cards and for data sheets, for data sets, you know, at the margins, they do have things, but in all reality, that doesn't necessarily ensure ethics. It just ensures a level of transparency for other engineers. So now you can see how we did what we did. That doesn't mean they didn't put out an entire set of values that they're making mandatory and into their workflows. In Amazon, even further behind Google. And you don't even hear about their ethics team. They have people in ethics. The only problem within Amazon is their ethics team is embedded with their compliance team. And compliance is all about laws and regulations already written. And so when your compliance person is your boss or the same role as ethics, then they're waiting for laws to be written to try to influence them. They're not over with the engineers and R&D and trying to force the values into the workflows. So those are the challenges. And that's the reason why it cannot possibly be left to these big companies alone, which is why today's panel is extremely important, or at least the subject is procurement. Because Amazon and Microsoft went head to head for a $10 billion contract with the DoD. When the DoD writes its rules on procurement, at that point, they can exercise $10 billion worth of market power to say, here's what I want to see in your workflows to win this bid. Now, I can tell you without violating confidence that didn't happen before. There were a set of rules, of course, but remember the Defense Innovation Board that Eric Schmidt was heading up, that was still in a work in progress before in the award happened before they'd come out with their recommendations. So that power is still there. But when you're dealing with entities like a Google, Microsoft, Amazon, it's like what Dr. Liu was saying, when there's so much market power, the only competing market power that can deal with that really is the government. And then within our government, at least, the only entity that really has that type of muscle is the Department of Defense. So it can have a huge, it can and it will have a huge impact on the marketplace. The only question is, how much influence does it want to have? What are the values? What values do they want to push down? So until January 2021, it was hands off because, you know, to give President Trump and administration credit, they did have an AI task force, but their AI task force was very similar to the Internet task force in 1996, right? Which basically, like part of the Communications Decency Act in Section 230, basically said, okay, hands off. And so that really gave a green light to these companies. And the only thing that has put brakes on these companies right now is what happened in the summer of 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement, which brought attention to the way that facial recognition was being used. And you combine that with the fact that facial recognition was being used in COVID contact tracing data and public health data was being matched to facial recognition data to crack down on protesters. When that happened, that's what then began to increase the level of scrutiny that was being put on these companies. But the idea that the companies can self-govern, not going to happen. It won't happen. So there's going to have to be a combination of regulation plus the market power of the entities that citizens rely on to represent them in order to put those in check. So I didn't mean to go that much on it, but Microsoft, okay, they're trying because they have the scars. Google, Amazon, no chance.
Okay, well, thank you for that comprehensive answer. So maybe we'll revisit this again. I think this is quite critical to understand to what extent companies can self-regulate, if at all. But I'd like to turn to Dr. Liu. So I have, so as you can imagine, he's in the self-driving world. I have a small Model 3 Tesla, and I've paid for full self-driving capability. But I've hardly used it. So I've contributed a little bit to Elon Musk's wealth, but not used any of the, and partly, one of the questions was that if there's an accident, how does the liability work? So I think the broader question here for Dr. Liu is that having a fair insurance policy is a prerequisite for any procurement project, and especially for safety sensitive solutions such as autonomous vehicles. So in the self-driving cars world, what is a sensible AI insurance policy in that area?
Thank you so much. Before I jump onto the question, I would like to thank you, Will and Steve, for the detailed answers you gave. I really learned a lot. So when we started this business, when we had to deal with AI procurement, there's nowhere I can find the answer online or from, say, Harvard Business Review. I wish there was an article describing the process. So we had to learn it the hard way. I really hope that we can summarize what we talk about today. Today, we give so much experience on this topic. I really hope to summarize, and we can together publish a paper to guide people to go through the process, to push for a change. Whether it's through a agency like World Economic Forum or some other agency, you have to push for the change. For us, we learned it the hard way. I'm glad that Dr. Kosh, you brought a very good question, insurance. So we ship autonomous vehicles. So each time we ship, we get a question. How do you deal with insurance policy? Because the traditional way when they acquire or they purchase vehicles, it always comes with a very good insurance policy, but not autonomous vehicle. Then we had to go to different insurance companies to come up with a quote. But there's no way they can give us a quote because there's no precedence in insuring autonomous vehicles. So as a startup, we have, on the one hand, we had to deal with the government, different levels of governments. On the other hand, we have to handle the insurance policy. We have to deal with so many different insurance agencies in order to come up with even a minimum coverage. So as if the government is pushing all the burdens onto their suppliers. They had a problem they did not know how to deal with, then they expected us to deal with those. So it's really a painful process to come up with a insurance policy. We have to tailor make the policy, and the policy is so expensive. for us to ship just one vehicle. So we had to push for change. Again, I wish that we had this conversation 2 or 3 years back, that I can learn so much from here, and then we can together push for change. But yeah, that's the reality today. We are rebuilding the whole global supply chain. The supply chain includes insurance companies, includes component suppliers for AI, includes algorithm suppliers for AI, including the buyers as well. The buyer being either a large business, large enterprise, or the government. So we are reshaping, rebuilding this whole global supply chain just for AI, but there's no guidance at all. So today, this meeting, this panel, it's a great panel to just kick off the process for a universal guidance. And thank you so much for all the panelists. It's really, I learned a lot personally from this conversation.
Thank you, Xiaoshan. I think if there are any government students here, policy students, there are a lot of good PhD topics here, because it looks like it's really, open field at this point. So I wanted to get back to Will Griffin, who said there's no one size fits all. In fact, everything seems to be a unique case. But I would think that maybe some sizes are better fitting than others. So the question is, when you've looked at different cities, corporations, state, federal governments, etc., which of them do you think are actually asking industry vendors the right questions, or at least better questions than others, in terms of what to look for in terms of ethical AI? And so is there, or are they just lost and they're struggling for how to deal with this issue?
So the reason why there's opportunity for so many graduate students and new professionals is because almost everyone is doing it poorly, even though they're doing it poorly differently. So I'll give you a few examples. New York City a few years ago had a big splash. So they were going to have this AI innovation task force. They wanted the lead. Mayor de Blasio said, we're going to be the first of the smart cities, and everything from trash collection to make it a more efficient city. Well, anyway, 18 months later, they had to disband the task force. And this is even before COVID. Why? Because they couldn't agree on what the values were. And then they put too many vendors at the table around the task force. So then that took you away from values and took you specifically to outcomes and specific verticals. So they didn't get their values straight. So that was a mess. But in New York, despite what people think about New York at the very moment, New York is one of the more developed municipal systems in the world. In fact, people come from around the world to study the way New York operates. But in this area, they were a disaster. The city of San Diego, which many people believe probably next to Austin is the most livable city in the United States. They wanted to be first with a GE product called smart streetlights. So in 2016, the mayor announced that we're going to be the first smart streetlight program, which replaced 8,000 light bulbs, like streetlights in the city, with LED lights. They were going to have sensors on them. They were going to save a lot of money. The trick was they also had cameras on them, which means that they were going to increase public safety. And then they implemented the principles, the Microsoft principles that GE had adopted, the fairness, accountability, the transparency, and the ethics principles. And then they had an open records opportunity where watchdog groups could come in and they could see what was on the cameras, and they could see what was captured in the public spaces and the efficiency that was achieved by the LEDs. Well, anyway, 9 months later, the law enforcement or the police force comes out and says our streetlight program is great. We solved 800 crimes using video from the data. With this, woke up the watchdog groups, because they said, well, in order to solve 800 crimes, that means you're probably seeing 2 to 3 million people and tens of millions of interactions in public spaces through these cameras, which this was never thought of as a reason why we were doing it. It was supposed to be, we funded it under a sustainability climate change rationale because the LED lights made us more efficient and we were going to save money. Well, anyway, they requested the records from the city of San Diego under these great AI ethical principles. They requested the records, and then 6 months later, the city of San Diego did not turn over the records. And then the law enforcement didn't turn over the records because they were embarrassed with all of the things that they actually caught on the cameras. The program went far beyond the original intent and the scope because they didn't understand the power of the technology. So as a result, after a year and a half of running the program, then the city of the mayor, there was a lawsuit, and then the city council voted unanimously to end the program. Then the mayor stopped the program. The only problem is now nobody knows how to get the cameras detached from the LED street lights because they were built as one program. And then you can't go back to GE because GE saw all the political blowback and actually sold their smart streetlight division. They decided they just wanted to be in the software. They didn't want to be in the streetlight hardware part of the business. So that's two major cities that have not figured it out. Then, of course, we saw last summer with law enforcement procurement, and this is going to be a big challenge because what people are really worried about is the creation of a surveillance state. And what it's exposing is that our civilian or our citizen city councils don't really have control over law enforcement, which is the real area where we worry about surveillance. So in most cities, the mayor is theoretically in charge of the police departments and law enforcement, but in a practical reality, political sense, they really are not. And when that is true, a procurement policy can be set at a city level that law enforcement doesn't follow or is not obligated to follow. So when you say, what are the good examples? I can give you some extreme these are a couple examples, but there are other extreme examples. So when it doesn't work out, so when law enforcement was exposed, the city doesn't have doesn't have practical control over law enforcement. It can be in the city charter, but that between that and actual real world control are two different things. So the city of Boston decided, you know what, we can't figure it out yet. Let's ban facial recognition for right now. San Francisco did the same thing, ban facial recognition for law enforcement. Portland did the same thing. So when jurisdictions can't quite figure out how the procurement policy should be, they just say, you know what, we don't need this smoke right now. So then they ban the acquisition of the technology, which is really what us and technology companies really fear and don't want, because when things get banned, that actually stifles the innovation. And then there are no resources to build on the field, to expand the field, to bring the benefits of the technology to humanity. And I think that's the reason why probably people in this room and people in this call are like, look, and you know, and we've had these conversations outside of our own company saying, look, we got to get our stuff together. Because if we don't get our stuff together, the entire world is going to be San Francisco. The whole world is going to be San Diego. You know, the whole world's going to be Portland. Like, you know, you could say, oh, well, I'm not in facial recognition. I don't really care about that anyway. I'm really about robot process automation. That's my thing. All right, guess what? If the policymakers can't figure it out, you get enough public criticism, they will ban it. They will not try to figure it out. They're going to do whatever they need to do to get the pressure off of their backs. And so that's why it's really important that things like this happen. The work that, you know, Ashley Cassavant is doing with AI Global and the Data Nutrition Project, the certification project, it's all about, and Steve made this point at the beginning, like it's all about getting the trust of the citizens and being able to explain yourself to watchdog groups and advocates in a way that's actually true and credible in how you are actually protecting and benefiting society. And so, you know, just to get back to your question, and I'm sorry if you work at the city of Austin, not ready for prime time, you know, in any way. You know, state governments are behind even the cities, to be honest with you. So I think the best opportunity will be for the federal government to lay out more than guidelines. I actually think that the federal government should use procurement as an example of the principles that they want to see in the industry, and preferably on a really set of really high profile projects.
Okay, well, that's terrific. I actually wanted to respond to you because I think the whole idea about cameras in cities is a great case study of the benefits as well as perils of AI technology. But before I do that, there is one more poll we wanted to do, and that actually poll goes with the autonomous vehicle question. So let me ask that. And the poll is is saying, how safe will you feel in an autonomous vehicle? Do you feel very safe, moderately safe, and not at all safe? And I think the question is also depends on where the technology is. So let's say if you buy the state-of-the-art autonomous vehicle today, how safe would you feel as opposed to maybe in a future time? Well, I've tried it and I have my response, but let's see what the audience says. But so, well, I think, just to be the devil's advocate to the example that you said, so it turns out that about maybe 14 or 15 years back, UT led a big project proposal. It was like a $30 million project proposal. It involved my colleague, Al Bovic, myself, and about 20 other researchers on what we could do if we would scatter lots of cameras in densely populated areas, right? And turns out that there are a lot of things you can we can do. So, for example, you can understand traffic, you can understand problems with roads, you can understand energy usage in buildings. These things, again, you don't need to know who the person is. You just need to know the person is walking or running or driving. Um, you can figure out where the next bike lane should go, and so on. The proposal was rejected because people were horrified with the thought of having cameras in where people live. And this was before, now it's become ubiquitous. At least places like London, they're all over the place. So it was a very new idea, but in the process, we also realized that there are some benefits. And, for maybe for certain things, you can have facial recognition. For some things, you do not need that. If you do, how can you also ensure privacy of individuals and see that those recognition is not used for unintended purposes, whether they come, as an addendum to LED bulbs or just by themselves. So I think there are benefits as well, and part of it is to have the properly mm, formulated procurement so that you can mitigate the risks, but still do not throw away the benefit. As you said, otherwise the gut reaction would be just ban it. And that's going to be a huge loss to the society as well. And while I while you respond to that, I did not see any questions. So the attendees, if you have questions, please shoot.
So yes, I agree with you. And that's the reason why I work in the field, because I believe that innovation is going to make us a better society. I believe innovation over time has made us a better society. And I believe it will continue to make us a better society. So in the case of facial recognition, yes, well, in the case of cameras, yes, right. Good. So that was one of the rationales in the San Diego Streetlight program, which is it's going to make our traffic camera system more efficient. Because they could use the sensors and they could track data. What was not disclosed was the extent that law enforcement was going to have access to this data. So that's important. So, cameras is almost just like any technological innovation. When used correctly and transparently, then it's beneficial. When used incorrectly and without transparency, it's not beneficial. Just like even the First Amendment, which is the most sacred of amendments in the United States, there's a limit on it in the Constitution, which is you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You cannot use your right, or you cannot use technology and innovation in a way that will create harm. In what we advocate, especially in the values world, is that there are no such thing as unintended harms or unforeseen consequences. Those are elements in the law, but in technology, you can't on one hand say, man, video cameras with these sensors is going to be the greatest thing to civilization and create smart cities and usher in a whole new millennium. And then at the same time say, oh, we didn't realize that this was actually going to take pictures of kids playing in their front yard. We didn't know the cameras would be able to do that. So you can't claim all these benefits of innovation on one hand and then not say you realize like the power and the impact of the cameras on the other hand. So I would be the last person to say stifle innovation, stop using technology. That's exactly what we're trying to forestall. But the other thing we're trying to do is when we say not only is there technical reasoning, not only is there logical reasoning, but there's also ethical reasoning. And if you're well versed in ethical reasoning, just like your logical reasoning and your technical reasoning, it should make you more creative. You should come up with a broader range of solutions. You should be able to visualize ways to use this technology that are beneficial to a broader set of stakeholders. And we believe that as a technologist, that's an obligation. So the last point I'll say on this is, if you go into the law, in order to be a lawyer, you have to be licensed by various jurisdictions. There's probably, since the mid 1800s, there's probably 3, but probably if you go back to the 1700s, there's probably like 400 or 500 years worth of framework, ethical framework for the law. If you go back into medicine, which is probably the first area that had a framework for it, if we leave out the priests and the reverends and the imams, if we leave those guys out, there's a framework for medicine going all the way back to Descartes in the University of Paris in the 1500s. So you have 500 years of an ethical framework and duties in that discipline. Well, in computer science and in engineering, there is no comp. And even in business school, if you go back to the early 1900s, post trust busting, there's 100 years of trying to get ethics in the business, including accounting licenses, including, in order to trade stocks, you need a Series E, you need a Series 63. There are ethical standards, but in computer science and engineering, there is no analog. So they literally just started thinking about ethics. And this is not a knock on the profession. This is just the reality in the way that they were trained and in the way that they were educated. It wasn't part of their curriculum. It wasn't part of a Stanford curriculum for ethics and engineering until 2 years ago. Computer science. So there's a whole world there. Now you could take philosophy, of course, and there were courses on philosophy and tech. Harvard had a few, for the last 20 years, but it never was a requirement. And it never was baked into the way they were trained. And then they're not studying for a test where they're going to be licensed, where they have to be licensed in their field in order to do it. Because the whole mythology was, hey, you could do this out of a garage. You don't need training. You don't need to be licensed. So there's not a whole school of thought of ethics around tech. And so that's where we are now. Like we're business schools 19 post the crash. We're business schools 1931 right now, right? We're law schools post slavery 1866 right now at the end of the Civil War. Like that's where we are in terms of ethics and tech. And I think if we realize kind of what we're up against, then I think that companies in governments and advocates will be a lot more aggressive about what we're saying needs to happen in the area around ethics and tech. I know we talked about cameras. We started out talking about cameras, but I think it really is these core values issues that need to be addressed, and how we get that embedded into the education for the disciplines, and how we get it embedded into the workflows of each and every use case for every piece of technology being developed.
And
yeah, Steve, go ahead.
yeah, I just wanted to, I love what you said, Will, and I just want to add on to that. My big concern is the regulatory whiplash that's going to occur from us not taking control of this on the supplier side, on the vendor side. We are masters of our own destiny at this point, and we can learn some really strong lessons from social enterprise and social media and the lack of, I mean, I railed on this 15 years ago, developing social enterprise platforms, the lack of considerations for human behavior and social, behavioral impact, social impact. A lot of it was, hey, I'm an engineer. I came up with this really cool idea. Let's try it. And we just threw it out there without consideration for, this could really be damaging. And, for some people, you can't anticipate what that damage might be. And we have a definite genie out of the bottle situation with a lot of the models that have been built and with the data that results from it. So San Diego may have turned that off, but that data is sitting somewhere. And at some point, somebody's going to get their hands on that data and they're going to do something with it. And this goes back to, the fundamental issues we have with data bias. It has to do with data legacy and not really understanding why something was gathered. I did something for a specific purpose without ever considering all the other stakeholders that are going to be affected by that. So I think it's really critical for us to speak loudly and forcefully and push the issue really hard. And we might just have to, have a lot of sharp elbows for the next half decade if we're going to prevent something like CCPA, that version of CCPA coming back on machine learning activities. And suddenly we find ourselves vastly limited when we could be really benefiting humanity in an incredible way.
Terrific. So I think I'd like to round off the panel. I just wanted to mention that at UT in McCombs, there's a Center for Ethics. There are people like Professor Prentice, who are specialized in ethics. In engineering, it turns out our three deans back, Ben Streetman would teach a course on ethics and engineering. But as Will mentioned, it was a optional course. Very, very few students took it. And also classical ethics is more how to think about interactions between humans or humans and nature. But now we also have to think about interactions between humans and some things that humans have created. And those things are, probabilistic, non-deterministic systems with, that might take, in some sense, some intelligence of their own. So I think there are these newer dimensions of ethics, which is also much more closely tied in with the underlying AI technology. And engineers, computer scientists need to be very, very well aware of that going forward. Maybe even have at least a 1-unit course at UT. So this is for the good systems folks to consider.
I did want to add. Karen Landholt in the Department of Computer Science teaches the behavioral ethics course that she started last spring.
Yeah, she's a new faculty. So
yeah,
we are making.
That's a great course.
Yeah, we are making baby steps in the right direction. Yeah, okay, terrific. So I'd like to thank the audience for participating and the terrific panelists that we had today. And then finally, the staff of Good Systems who've been really on top of things and did a really professional job in enabling this. And the World Economic Forum for promoting this very unique partnership between UT and WEF. So thank you all and have a great day.